Hello, I'm Bob Westrope. I believe these things to be true. 1. We live in an age of abundance, where for the first time we have the means to eradicate human suffering, want, and need. 2. Our world is in unprecedented danger. Too many issues that must be dealt with simultaneously, from climate change to an all-out assault on democracy itself. 3. We have years, not decades, to prevail, to make possible a new age of wonder. 4. The root problem is a systemic global leadership insufficiency. 5. We can't rely alone on current systems and structures to address this insufficiency. It's time for big ideas. And 6. It's on us to fix it. The Boom Xers born from 1946 to 1980. We have the experience, networks, power, money, time, and most importantly, the motivation. It's our children's world. It's our legacy. Join me as I explore the big ideas needed to inspire our generation to action. Ideas offered by leading thinkers, doers, and activists, united by the understanding that we all share one very small and very fragile planet. Before we start, the Boom series of podcasts will be brought to you by several sponsors. Since Boom is intended to promote actionable, measurable, and meaningful impact, I wanted to make a statement in the acceptance of our first sponsor. That's why I invited Story Miners to be the first to support us. Looking at the 10 years we have to fix the world, each of us will undoubtedly face situations where success will depend on painting a super clear picture of the future. The possibilities each of us sees and the means to get there have to make it clearly into the hearts and minds of our friends, fellow citizens, employees, partners, and customers. If we can't make the future clear and compelling, how can we expect others to join us to achieve it? Practically every leader faces the challenge of reshaping their organizations to meet whatever tomorrow brings. They must experiment while leading at the same time. It's not easy. Story Miners understands that strategy is best expressed as the story of who you are and where you want to be next. The easier that story is to understand, the more people can see themselves in it. That means faster and longer-lasting adoption. Story Miners are masters at this, with over 1,000 assignments, over 20 years, in 24 countries as evidence. To learn more about Story Miners, see the link at the bottom of this podcast. Now let's get started. Exactly 200 years ago, James Madison famously wrote, quote, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." Unquote. This quote has been historically conflated to mean that he was espousing easy access to government information. Accordingly, he was widely quoted as the Freedom of Information Act was conceived, debated, and passed in the United States Congress. But scholars agree that he was in fact referring to the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, and more generally, the need for a citizenry that had the capacity for critical thinking. To quote, "throw that light over the public mind, which is the best security against crafty and dangerous encroachments on the public safety," unquote. To Madison, the source of this power was the well-supported public school. For our purposes today, let's say any K through 12 school. We don't lack for examples of such crafty and dangerous encroachments on the public safety. Indeed, the election of Donald Trump, coming just 5 months after the Brexit vote in the UK, can be seen as the demarcation line at which we could say definitively that the light of the public mind had dimmed catastrophically and was, in fact, in danger of being extinguished altogether. Cue QAnon. There is a clear relationship between education on voting behavior, income, and health. Looking at US data on Wikipedia, data resonant with recent post-Brexit UK studies, my back-of-the-envelope read shows that the average red state voter lives in a state where 29% or more have at least a bachelor's degree, versus 37% in blue states. That's a 25% delta. Not surprisingly, on average, the same red state voter earns 25% less than his blue state relative, will die 2 years sooner, and is 8 times more likely to believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. This is not to suggest that the non-college educated voter makes poor decisions. There are far too many environmental variables to do so. But it does illustrate the need for quality education. For those who aspire to a new age of wonder, then reinventing the process of learning, that is, of equitably preparing new generations of thoughtful citizens with the basic competencies of critical thinking, is of existential importance. That process necessarily begins at the beginning, that is, kindergarten or earlier, and runs through to grade 12. Helping us throw light on the consequent challenge and the opportunity of transforming learning and education is Stephen Hurley, a lifelong educator and thought provocateur. Stephen taught for 30 years in the public school system as teacher and then teacher-instructor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and today is the founder, architect, and chief catalyst at Voice Ed Radio, a 24/7 internet-based radio station designed to broaden and deepen the conversations on learning. Not inconsequentially, Stephen is also the producer of this podcast series. Okay, Stephen, so what is your big idea?
Well, my big idea relates to something I'm very familiar with, and that is schools, and specifically public schools. And so my big idea is that public schools need to be reimagined as vibrant and accessible places for community dialogue and community development.
Well, that sounds impressive. So where did this big idea come from?
Well, I said I'm very familiar with schools. I've worked in schools for nearly 40 years in and around the public education system across Canada. Of course, like you, I was a student for the first part of my life, and so I don't think I've ever left school. But I have been a keen observer, not only of the profession, the teaching profession, but also what happens in schools and the relationships and the dynamic and the politics of it. In my later years, I've become kind of a policy geek in terms of policy around education. And in that time, I have come to understand that we are undervaluing, if not undermining, the role that schools can and should be playing in the life of a community. If you think about it, schools are embedded in communities, but I think more and more, and it's become a pain point for me and a point of frustration, schools are becoming isolated and isolating. And I think that this idea comes from that sense of frustration and also that sense of hope.
Why do you think, or how do you think it is a big idea?
It's a big, small idea. It's big in the sense that it flies in the face of the way we have come to think about schools in recent decades. So I think it forces us to think beyond, and anything that forces us to think beyond our current context, I would consider to be a big, if not more than small, idea. It's a grounded idea, though. It's not a big pie in the sky, wouldn't it be nice, hopeful idea. I think it's something that many people can see happening in their own community. So it's a big idea that is rooted.
And we're going to be digging into that. So what problem is it addressing? So what's the thing that this fixes?
Well, I think it touches on a few problems, but I think the biggest problem is a sense of, as I said at the outset, of isolation that is developing in our communities I don't know about you, but I grew up in a fairly new suburban area back in the 1960s. I remember neighborhoods being places where you kind of knew each other, and
Hmm.
you had a number of parents on the street, and you knew you couldn't get away with much. But also there was a sense of social interaction among neighbors, and there was a sense of community. Many people were involved in church communities and in school communities, sometimes sports associations.
Hmm.
I think that the human activity and the relationships that I see happening, at least in the neighborhoods that I'm involved with, are less than that. Often people don't even know who is next door to them. People go across town with their kids for play dates.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's a sense that my life as a community member is outside of this particular area. That at the same time, schools are constituted by and large geographically. So you
Hmm.
have a neighborhood school that's there to serve the neighborhood, but I think it's a different neighborhood now. So, and I think that's a problem. People may say, "Well, that's you're sort of being Pollyannish about that." But I think we've come to think about the world in large strokes, in global from a global perspective. But I think a lot of the problems we see and a lot of the challenges that we're trying to tackle can also be found in our immediate neighborhood. So that I have come to realize that local communities and neighborhoods and the connection between neighborhoods are really a basic and essential unit of human growth and development. I think our local communities are a microcosm of what we see in a larger scale, and that means that the problems that we want to solve out there can also be found in here.
Hmm.
And so you may be asking, well, what do schools have to do with this? I think public schools are one of the last bastions in many communities of that sense of public space and public good. And I think that creates a really interesting and important opportunity for people to think about gathering in those spaces to talk about what we've just been talking about, some of the issues, some of the problems, some of the challenges that we face as a community.
Hmm.
And so I think schools as a an architectural designed place, as a physical space, but also as a conceptual space, can help us gather people around the problems that we want to solve.
Hmm. Now that all sounds
Yes,
great,
yeah, I know,
uh,
I know.
but when you were invited to this podcast, we shared the tenets on which this
Mm.
podcast is based with you, and they are broadly humanist and broadly globalist, which you referred to earlier. There's an assumption here that the public square that you talk about implicitly shares those values in a way. But the question that we're seeing all over is, what if they don't? What if the community leaning is towards intolerance and addressing grievances, real and imagined? What happens then? How does that shape or frame that central position of the school?
From a big picture perspective, I believe you hit the nail on the head when you said these are broadly humanist values and globalist. And I think in saying that, we're also saying that they're shared by the very fact of humanity, the very fact that we are human. There is more than a tendency, there is an affinity towards human connection and human gathering. But the real part of it, the realist part of me says, yet, even in the community that I live in, I have seen evidence of communities gathering around shared values, which may not be the values that I ascribe to. In committing to a sense of public space, and when you think of it, in our communities now, in our uh, communities that are focused in our societies that are focused mainly on economic value and economic efficiency and proficiency, we've lost a lot of the public spaces. We don't have a
Excellent
lot,
point. Yeah.
and so when you think of public space, though, you also need to think about the commitment to, I guess, the process of dialogue, the process of conversation, the process of connecting. So I'm not just saying throw people together in the gymnasium at a school and let's have at it. I
Hmm.
think there's an opportunity to re-engage people with the art of dialogue, the art of conversation, the art of
Hmm.
gathering, and the art of listening. And I think that it's precisely because these are not perfect spaces that we need this idea.
Well, and if we do that, we position schools as exemplars, hopefully, of critical thinking. There's a paucity of it right now, for sure.
And that's something that most 21st century leaning curriculum will ascribe to. It's one of the 6 C's or 7 C's that people ascribe to. We say we want critical thinking. Whether we do or not really is another question. But I think yes.
Hmm.
And the fact that our schools already have a demographic, a population of thinkers. They're
Hmm.
younger than you or I, but it's a perfect place to use as kind of ground zero for this type of thinking.
Now, what would your peers think? It strikes me that they, may well be part of the problem, or certainly the challenge in any kind of cultural adjustment.
There are a couple of ways that I could answer that. First of all, I think my peers would think, well, there goes Hurley with another one of his harebrained ideas. I think many of us have become accustomed to the status quo. Many of us have become so immersed in our own day to day problems and challenges and drives that this may seem like a harebrained idea. So I think we've come to accept that. And when you think of schools, it's nothing to say to a parent who wants to come into the school, well, where's your police record check? We have
Hmm.
security cameras at the doors. We have signs now in COVID times that you are not to enter the school. I have not been in my local school since March of 2019 or
Incredible. Yeah.
whatever.
Hmm.
Um, so I think people are looking for this type of thing, a new way of gathering around things that are important to them. I think you'd have to market it a little bit in terms of getting people interested in coming out, because people aren't used to coming out to school for something other than parent-teacher interviews or maybe a permit to rent the gym for a basketball game. So this is a new way of coming out, and I think that will take some work.
Now we talk, or I talk, in the preambles to these podcasts, and in my first podcast, or the first sort of foundational or core one, I talk about the new age of wonder that we're all aspiring towards. Again, one based on the tenets that we discussed and can be found at the bottom of all of the podcasts. If we were to execute on this vision that you describe, how would that help us, or be important in realizing this new age of wonder?
Well, I love the word wonder. And I think in my own life and in the life of my kids, when we talk about wonder, we talk about looking out and looking
Hmm.
outside, looking out into the night sky and wonderful, or looking at nature in that wonder filled stage. We need to develop a greater sense of curiosity and wonder for each other,
Hmm.
for human beings, not something outside ourselves, something inside ourselves. I think when we look at indigenous ways of knowing and a lot of learning about that, we find that sense of wonder in relationship. And I think this idea of public space, wherever it is based on raising that sense of relationship to a new level of importance. And that's wonderful.
No, it is. It is. I can see the dots connecting here. So let's connect them to our listeners, the folks that we sort of see as the core listener and reader of these podcasts are what we call boom Xers.
Right.
So people like you and I, in most cases, our children are in university, certainly out of public school. In my case, and in many, thinking more of our grandchildren, are there dots? How is this relevant to the boomers, the boom Xers?
I don't believe that there were glory days for the public square. As much as history will want us to believe that. But I do think that Boom Xers, the idea of reconnecting with people in vibrant ways, will resonate because
Hmm.
many of them probably remember, a group or a community they were involved with where they were engaged in either direct activism or thinking about the world in a different way and bringing that sense of hope to it. So I think there's an emotional connection to the idea. Certainly schoolhouses, and I lived in an old renovated schoolhouse in a community here in Ontario, and I would have older people come by the schoolhouse, on a regular basis, saying, I went to school here, and here's what
Hmm.
we did, and we had our school plays here, and we had community meetings here, and we had trustee meetings and quilting bees and the whole bit. I mean, that's not the public square that I'm talking about, but I think Boom Xers have some connection with schools and the idea that I'm proposing. But I also think that they have the time to get involved with some projects and some leadership initiatives. There's a lot of expertise in the community from the Boom Xers uh, on the sort of conversations that we need to have. And in addition, I think that connecting our generation, and I must say that my own kids are still in public school, and we're not that far off in age.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think we have communities where we house the elderly in pretty nice apartment buildings in some cases. Sometimes not so nice
Not
facilities.
so much. Yep. Yep.
Um, but I think there's an opportunity for Boom Xer generation to connect again with schools and to develop that sense of connectedness in the community that we all care for one another and we can all communicate with one another.
Well, it's odd that, certainly my an observation is that typically grandparents are more or less hands off with regard to the issues of education of their grandchildren, and it's odd because, as you point out, we not only have the time, but we have the experience, and certainly in my case, the reflection on that, 15-year period in our kids' lives. And at the time, we're so caught up in our jobs, in paying the rent. It's a completely different kind of reflection that one has now, and a completely different set of experiences, a body of experience that one has to offer. It's an interesting question,
Mm.
interesting challenge how we bring that to bear. And speaking of challenges, this does qualify as a big idea, and small big ideas are just fine. It's something that certainly I would argue needs to be scaled globally. But we can talk perhaps about that in the next part of the discussion. So the challenge then is, how do we fix this and who fixes it? And so what's your challenge?
Well, I am going to zero in on a part of the system, and this is a school level proposal. So I'm going to challenge all school leaders, and those are vice principals, those are principals, to begin to see themselves differently. And this is a mindset shift, not only as leaders of a school building, but as community leaders. Not the only community leaders, but as community leaders. And I think in adopting that mindset and the practices that come from that, we're going to see some shifts. So,
Mm-hmm.
if, for example, in August, September, instead of a principal holed up in the school with staff, why not take that staff that will be working with those kids on a walk around the neighborhood, on a walk around the community to take a look at who's there, what's there? It's not my idea. It's been done before, but I think it's such a powerful idea as a way to begin to see outside of that school building. So I'm going to challenge all school leaders to begin to think of themselves as community leaders.
And so if principals and vice principals were to do that 5 to 10 years out, what would success look like?
Well, I think one of the signs of success would be a full parking lot, pretty well all day and into the weekends at the school. But parking lot, maybe not. It's not really eco-friendly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you would begin to notice some things happen in the community. You would begin to notice the grounds of the community looking different because parents and community members would be welcome in to take care of the school in a different way. You would find a multi-directional flow of human capital and ideas in and out of the school. Right now, kids are dropped off by their parents. and there isn't really a lot of connection. It's this major handoff at the beginning and end of every school day. And so I think not only during the school day, you're going to find the community involved in a different way. I think you'll find that the community is being accessed by the school as a resource, as opposed to the school just telling uh, parents and community members what they're doing or what they need to be doing at home, for example. We have a lot of diversity in many of our communities across this country, and I know around the world. And just because a community member doesn't speak the language as well as someone that was born in that community doesn't mean they don't know anything and don't have
Hmm.
things to say about the world and about the way the world is. I think we have to challenge those assumptions. So that would be another look for. I think another very positive and grounded look for would be the way that communication travels, and now many schools are playing with and trying to commit to multilingual communication, for example. How do the lines of communication get formed in this type of vision? And I think there would be a sense of intentional events being designed to welcome the community, to draw the community in around important questions, and not just questions of life in that community, but questions of life in general.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, Christopher Phillips in the States developed a concept called the Socrates Cafe, where he opened up public spaces. His idea was libraries and bookstores and cafes, but I added to that pubs. And just gathering people around some of those big questions of humanity, what it means to be alive in this world. So those intentional events, and so the school becomes known as a place to expect and look out for that type of activity. So it's not just, we could rent your gym for our teams, but this is actually a place of learning for the whole community.
So much more organically involved, dynamic kind of communications, as you say, two-way with the elements, the institutions of the local society.
Yeah, from a design, a biological metaphor perspective,
Hmm.
the walls of the schoolhouse will become semi-permeable.
Good, good. Now, you are an intractable optimist.
Yes, I am.
I think incapable of saying anything negative, but I'm really going to challenge you to
Okay.
tap into your inner pessimist and or cynic. Probably would be a better description. But what if we don't do this? What does failure look like in your estimation?
Well, I have a clear sense of what that looks like, and I'll put my pessimistic hat on. I think we will continue to go down the road that the neoliberal ideology wants us to go down, and that's make schools market driven, market oriented, marketable.
Hmm.
That way they become isolated, they become more irrelevant to the community. They become more closed off from the community, and it's happening already. COVID has pushed that sense, but I think failure would look like schools as commodities.
Yeah, and as you say that, I'm thinking of one track is basically preparing employees, and the other is preparing and nurturing citizens.
And I think we can do both. I think
For
we
sure.
can do both,
Hmm.
and I think we need to do both.
Hmm.
Um, but there's one. I think there's a preferred path, and it's there's a whole conversation about what happens in schools. But my big idea has to do with the way we see schools as part of the life of the community.
Hmm. Now, the principal as CEO, it strikes me, is the apex of most teachers' careers, at least somebody outside looking in. Isn't it more about promoting teachers that have the mindset and the ambition to be community leaders as opposed to career tracks being oriented towards the administrator?
I think that if we have the leadership at the administration level, then I think that my experience is that that mindset filters down to the teaching profession, to the classroom, to what happens in the classroom. I'm going to push back a little on the apex metaphor because I think
I thought you might.
uh, I took the principles courses and I was totally disillusioned uh, by them and
Hmm.
the amount of liability that is on the shoulders of principals these days. I think it used to be, especially if you're a male back in the 60s, if you're a male and you didn't think that you wanted to be a principal, especially at
Hmm. Very
elementary
good point.
school,
Very good point.
then someone would have questioned that.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think that's changed. I wouldn't want us to get to the point where we bring in administrators from outside of the teaching profession, but we're long past the point where every teacher's goal and dream is to be a school administrator.
Well, and there's no doubt either that there's a very large pool of teachers that would aspire to be community leaders who are also very good administrators. I have no doubt about that.
To that point, I think many, and I'll say right now, across the province of Ontario, the principal pools, the administration pools that leaders are drawn from, are pretty well empty. There's not many people going into those pools now. But if we were to re-engage people's imagination as educators, that hey, your job is not to cover the liability piece. Your job is to get out there and engage the community, and you're going to be leading a building that is known for this.
Hmm.
Then I think you'd get a whole lot and a different sort of person as well. I might even go back and put on the administrative hat.
Oh no, that sounds like a great job description. I would that would be something that I would find engaging as well. So, who are the actors? We're focused on the vice principals and the principals, as you talk about. Who are the other actors that need to be engaged?
Everybody. Everybody. Well, you've got your students already. I mean,
Hmm.
they're your captive audience that you're going to build this vision around. Certainly, the community organizations need to buy into it. They need to be willing to work with school leaders to make this happen. Uh, I think there are a lot of community organizations that rent space in schools, but don't really see themselves as part of the schools. You have your educators, your teachers, other school staff that I think this could capture their imagination. I think your superintendents, your district level, ministry level, government level actors need, and they've been talking about this for years. They have been talking about schools as community hubs for years. But the policy hasn't really been there. It hasn't been a strong, you must do this, or this is the way things will be type of thing.
Well, there's an interesting question. That policy. Who are the principal proponents of it historically?
I think schools themselves probably have been. I guess in the the 60s, 70s, the education reforms. Anytime you have a education reform movement, you also have a community reform movement attached to that, and
Hmm.
saying schools could be different places. But I think that maybe the more important policy question is what has stood in the way of this happening,
Hmm.
and certainly the liability piece, the facilities piece, the revenue piece around community use of schools. We're at a point now in some of our jurisdictions where teachers they're talking about teachers having to pay parking because of revenue deficits. It's hard to imagine this in that sort of context. But I think by and large, we need to get out of the way and let some of this happen before we start talking about making it policy. Because as soon as you make it policy, then you have to police it, right?
Right, right, right,
Um,
right.
but I think this is an idea whose time has come, and we just need to get out of the way of people who want to give it a try, enable them, give them some funding to make it happen, and see where it goes.
One of the biggest inhibitors to any initiative is the culture of those who are expected to execute it. That's true in policing. It's true in healthcare. As a parent and observer, I would say the same is true of teaching.
Yes.
The thing that blocks a lot of great initiatives are teachers, and that's not to say that, of course, There are an incredible number of great teachers, but it's also, it seems the case that there are legacy elements within the discipline that restrict or stop initiatives like yours.
Right. So, one of the things that I have noticed happening over the past couple of decades, and certainly since I began teaching in the mid 80s, the early 80s, is that more and more responsibility, more and more expectations are being placed on schools and on the teaching profession.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's not just teachers, the three R's, let's just say, that, and only one of those R's actually begins with R. Uh, but the fact that more and more is expected of schools, and seems that all the social problems in a community are placed on the school. So I think it's become part of the mindset of teachers that they have to do everything, and that everything rests on their shoulders, and that comes out in different ways. There's some research being done on the importance of tutoring to fill some of the gaps in this post-COVID time. And as a teacher, if my kids, for example, my students, for example, parents came in and said, well, I have them enrolled in a tutoring program, I would take offense to that, because that's my job, is to teach them. And so I think one of the things that has to change is that teachers have to be given the freedom to say, it's our job. And I don't want to go to that old saw, it takes a village, but it's kind of that opening up as teachers to the fact that although they've been told and given the messages that everything is their job, not everything is. And if we can sort of loosen those ties on who owns what and who has responsibility over what, the whole looking out to the community as a resource, not only for what goes on during the school day, but for how that building comes to life after the school day is over.
Offering that opportunity, it's not only a responsibility, but offering that opportunity to teachers, I would imagine, makes it a vastly more interesting and constructively challenging career. Certainly a relevant one. I mean, we all have the experience of a teacher that changed our life. It strikes me that an initiative, as you've suggested, is one where, if that's the role of the school, it provides the opportunity for more teachers to be pivotal in the development of a child. And it also strikes me that we're, as I said earlier, the distinction between developing employees and citizens, by engaging students in the community through the time they're in that K through 12 process, one would imagine would absolutely make them much more engaged and thoughtful and contributing citizens.
And to be clear, this big idea, in one sense, it's not about schools, in that K to 12 narrative. It's about schools as a public space
Mm-hmm.
for the community as well. So maybe an expanding horizons metaphor would work. People may leave this conversation saying, "Well, what is he really saying? That community members should be in teaching kids?" No, I'm saying that we have an opportunity. We have a public space. We have public buildings in all of our communities, and they could be truly hubs that are much more actively involved in the conversations that make a community a community.
That is an excellent way to end our conversation. So thank you very much, Stephen.
This has been a pleasure. Thanks, Bob.
Here are some of my thoughts from my conversation with Stephen today. His idea that schools must be transformed as public squares of our communities is inspired. I'm not sure that I remember a time when they could be described that way, but there is no doubt that, largely for security and liability reasons, they have become islands that are quite detached from community life. Certainly, that must be reversed. To see them reimagined as vibrant, diverse, fully integrated elements of a public commons, and thus shaping citizens and not just workers, is to be applauded. It remains problematic as to what values will inform the curriculum of the new school as public square, as the desperate battle for the control of school boards in the United States demonstrates. The humanist, globalist values that are assumed as the base of Stephen's vision for the reinvented school are too often today losing out to the calculated and coordinated attack of those who not only reject those values, but reject with them empirical and objective fact. Nor am I quite as generous as Stephen in his assessment with respect to the role of teachers in leading the needed cultural transformation. I'm leery of self-policing professions, be they teachers, police, doctors, or lawyers. Though they are clearly in the best position to police their ranks, weeding out those that do not meet the standards of the profession, the track record of any of these groups, notably including their unions, is, to be generous, disappointing. However, I am also utterly convinced that a small minority of any profession, if not a majority, would be broadly supportive of a world defined by something like our tenets. So the challenge is to connect, empower, and mobilize that 10, 20, or even 50% plus of members to transform their profession, in this case, the art and practice of learning. I was heartened by Stephen's observation that the thinkers best positioned to lead the charge to instill critical thinking in our learning processes are the clients of the system, the children the system exists to serve. I wonder, too, about the power of connecting these youthful thinkers with the most powerful generation so far in human history, we Boom Xers. Now, to Stephen's challenge, that is that school leadership must be seen as community leaders first and administrators second. Article 8 of our tenets states that all persons must, quote, have access to such learning as is necessary to realize one's needs and desires and to be an informed and engaged citizen, unquote. Stephen asserts that to facilitate the development of effective and engaged citizens, we must do that in the incubator of citizenship, the school at the heart of community. In turn, it is for the principal and vice principal to lead in the needed transformation by aspiring to be community leaders and not just CEOs. Perhaps the same should be said of corporate CEOs as well. Stephen has delivered the nucleus of a powerful vision and challenge. Quite easily, one could imagine its execution to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and certainly timely. After all, there are only so many principals, vice principals, and aspirants to those positions that need to be incubated and supported in their transformation. It begs the question, though, who will execute this big idea and hold to account those who have been challenged? Who will experiment to determine the optimal execution and then scale those learnings around the world? It's pretty apparent now that aiming to retard the spread of ignorance locally or regionally is no more effective than trying to solve climate change in one place alone. So here's what I'd like you to do for now. First, click the follow button wherever and however you are accessing this podcast. See the links at the bottom of all print postings. Please note that at this time, we are not asking for your email address, but it is vital that we build a follower base as quickly as we can with your help. Second, please share this podcast with as many of your friends, family, peers, and colleagues as you can, and ask them to follow us. Third, please engage in the community discussions on your preferred platform, LinkedIn, Medium, or Facebook. These discussions will help elevate and refine the big ideas and the challenges that have been issued. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, imagine a world where our schools function as Stephen has suggested, preparing new generations to assume the mantle of citizenship and then of leadership in an age of wonder, where learning leadership conduct themselves in a manner consistent with something like our tenets. And imagine how you and your peers might leverage your years of experience, your time, your connections in a specific, measurable, accountable, relevant effort to reach and influence the principals and vice principals and implicitly the school administrators challenged by Stephen by 2035. To in some small yet vital way make the world better as only you can. Let me be frank. My purpose with this podcast series is to see if we can mobilize a well-funded global civic effort that leverages the learnings of Leaders Expedition. we're calling this new initiative Leaders X. If we want to refine the role of public schools and countless equally daunting initiatives like it simultaneously, I believe nothing less will or can work. Sometime soon, I hope we will move from discussion and imagination to action, to connecting, empowering, and mobilizing our uniquely positioned and powerful Boom Xer community to transform the world we have made. Until then, please reflect, engage, and spread the word. We broke it. Let's fix it.